All right, ready to dive into some serious ancient history? We're talking Neanderthals, people.
Neanderthals, always a fascinating subject.
You guys sent in a paper, though, Neanderthal Ancestry Through Time. And it goes way beyond the usual you're 2% Neanderthal stuff.
Absolutely. It's not just about how much Neanderthal DNA we have. This paper maps out how those genes actually got to us. It's like a genetic travel journal.
Okay, I'm already hooked. So how do they even begin to track something like that?
Well, it all starts with ancient DNA. They analyzed 59 ancient human genomes.
Wow, ancient. How far back are we talking?
Some of them are over 40,000 years old.
hmm
And they compared those with 275 modern genomes from all over the world.
So like a huge global family reunion, but with DNA instead of potato salad.
Exactly. And what they found is fascinating. It wasn't just a constant mixing of genes. This paper suggests there was one major interbreeding event between Neanderthals and the humans who migrated out of Africa.
Really? Just one. I thought it was more of a, long-term kind of thing.
That's the surprising part. And they figured this out using something called ancestry covariance.
Ancestry. What now?
It's like a genetic clock.
Wow.
By looking at how genes are grouped together on our DNA, they can estimate how long ago they were introduced.
So the closer the genes are in our DNA, the longer they've been hanging out together.
You got it. And they estimate this main interbreeding event happened around 47,000 years ago.
47,000. Wow. And how long did this intermingling last?
About 6,800 years.
6,800 years. That's longer than some civilizations. I thought Neanderthals were long gone by then.
Right. But there is definitely overlap, and this timeline actually lines up with fossil records.
So more of a complex relationship than a one-night stand then.
Exactly. But there's another layer to this. This was for the folks who migrated out of Africa. What about the people who stayed?
Yeah, did they miss out on the Neanderthal gene pool party entirely?
That was the assumption. But here's where it gets really interesting. More recent research suggests that even people with African ancestry have some Neanderthal DNA,
No way. So how did that happen?
likely from those who migrated out of Africa and then back again much later.
Wow. Talk about a homecoming. So it really seems like we're all part Neanderthal,
Hmm.
just to varying degrees. But inheriting genes isn't always like getting a nice family heirloom, right? Some are bound to be more useful than others.
You said it. And that's what we'll get into next, how natural selection decided which Neanderthal traits were a keeper and which ones were basically evolutionary junk mail.
So some Neanderthal genes were a hit, some were a miss. What were the hits?
Well, you can think of it like inheriting a toolbox from those Neanderthal ancestors. Some tools were great, helped them survive in these new environments outside of Africa. But some, not so much.
Not so much. How do they know which tools were duds in this prehistoric toolbox?
They looked for clues in our DNA, these things called deserts and adaptive introgression. Deserts were like, imagine tool is so useless it's not even in the toolbox anymore, just gone.
Gone. Not just rusty and forgotten in the back.
Completely tossed out. These were genes that were probably really bad for you back then. Like imagine a gene that made you super susceptible to a common cold.
Yeah, that's not a recipe for survival.
Exactly. Those individuals were less likely to pass on their genes, hence the deserts in our DNA.
Survival of the fittest, genetic addition. Okay, so those are the duds. What about adaptive introgression? Sounds fancier. Those are the good tools.
You got it. The tool's worth keeping. These genes actually helped our ancestors thrive, and the paper maps out exactly where these regions are.
So what kind of genetic goodies are we talking about here?
A lot of it has to do with adapting to the world outside of Africa. Like, take the BNC2 gene, the one that plays a role in skin pigmentation.
Skin pigmentation, so like how we tan.
Yep. Turns out, early humans living over 40,000 years ago, only about 25% of them had the Neanderthal version of this gene.
Okay, so not that common. What about today?
Today, it's closer to 65%.
Whoa, 25 to 65.
Yeah.
That's a massive jump. Are you saying we can thank Neanderthals for our tans?
Pretty much. It suggests that the Neanderthal version of BNC2 was really good at regulating skin pigmentation. Probably helped them deal with the lower UV radiation as they moved to higher latitudes.
So thanks to them, our ancestors didn't turn into lobsters every time the sun peeked out. Sweet. What else? What other cool stuff did we inherit?
Oh, tons of stuff, especially when it comes to immunity. Neanderthals had already been living in Europe and Asia for a while, so they had built up resistance to all sorts of local diseases.
Makes sense.
Those genes would have been like gold to our migrating ancestors, a ready-made immunity pack.
So they walked into this new world with a Neanderthal-powered immune system. Pretty cool.
Well,
But if these genes were so great, why don't we have more Neanderthal DNA today? Why just a measly couple of percent?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's probably a few things. For one, those early encounters probably involved relatively small groups of people, so the gene pool was already kind of limited.
Limited gene pool, so
Yeah.
like fewer options to begin with.
Right. And then on top of that, sometimes it's just random chance. It's called genetic drift. It can make certain traits more or less common, even if they don't really affect survival.
So like flipping a coin for your genes.
Kind of. Not always survival of the fittest. Sometimes it's just the luck of the draw. Plus, not all Neanderthal genes were helpful. Some were probably just neutral, no real advantage or disadvantage.
Like that old sweater you inherited but never wore.
Exactly. And some, well, some might have even been bad news in the long run. But here's where it gets really interesting. The X chromosome.
Oh, the X chromosome. That rings a bell from biology class, but remind me, what makes it so special?
Well, it carries a lot of genes related to, reproduction. And what's really strange is that Neanderthal ancestry on the X chromosome is way less frequent than in the rest of our genome.
Less frequent.
Yeah.
So were those X chromosome genes more likely to be those bad news genes we talked about?
Mm.
Or is there something else going on? Something else going on with the X chromosome? Like what?
Well, one theory is male hybrid infertility.
Hybrid infertility. Is that like a mule?
Mm.
Can't reproduce because it's a mix of a horse and a donkey.
Yeah, kind of like that. When you have closely related groups like Neanderthals and early humans interbreeding, sometimes the male offspring, they have trouble reproducing.
Huh. So all that mixing, and then evolution's like, nope, dead end.
It's harsh, but that's evolution for you. And because a lot of those genes for male reproduction are on the X chromosome, well, it makes sense that there'd be less Neanderthal ancestry there.
So those genes just kind of hit a wall.
Exactly. But hybrid infertility might not be the whole story. Some of it could also be those harmful genes we talked about before. Maybe some were concentrated on the X chromosome.
And got weeded out over time.
Right. Remember those deserts in our DNA? Well, they found huge deserts on the X chromosome. Some of those genes were so bad, completely wiped out.
Wow, that's kind of intense. So much for inheriting the family genes, huh? Okay, so we've covered a lot. We've got this single interbreeding event, then natural selection stepping in, deciding which genes are worthy, and this whole X chromosome mystery. What's the takeaway? What does it all mean?
I think the biggest thing is Neanderthals aren't some separate species, They're part of our story. This paper shows that there was this major interbreeding event 47,000 years ago, and it's still shaping us today.
It's mind-blowing. We could be inheriting everything from how our skin looks to how our immune system works from these ancient encounters. It makes you wonder, what else is buried in our genes?
Exactly. And remember, it wasn't a one-time thing. They probably interacted, shared resources, maybe even fell in love. It lasted thousands of years.
Wow.
This wasn't just some ancient hookup.
It's amazing how much more we're learning about these ancient humans. I mean, we still got mysteries, right? Like those X chromosome deserts. What were those genes? Why were they so bad?
Oh, tons of mysteries left to uncover. And don't forget, this paper mostly looked at people with non-African ancestry. But now there's evidence that even folks with African ancestry have a little Neanderthal DNA.
Right, from those humans who migrated back to Africa.
Yeah. It just goes to show you we're all more connected than we think.
It's like a giant family reunion, but across thousands of years.
Exactly. And the more ancient DNA we analyze, the more we'll learn about this incredible shared history.
Well, I think that about wraps things up for this deep dive. Any parting words for our listeners?
Just this. Neanderthals. They weren't just a different species. They were family. And we carry that legacy with us, not just in our DNA, but in our never-ending curiosity about where we came from.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. And to all our listeners, keep those questions coming because we'll keep exploring the most fascinating corners of science and history right here on The Deep Dive.